It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to June that I'm here. We talked a little bit, or had an exchange about what I might do for this talk. And one possibility was just to do a relatively narrow research project. But it seemed maybe potentially more interesting to do something broader that would bring together several different strands of research and get us thinking about something that's kind of unavoidable right now, which is, of course, to be thinking about territory, what it means, how it functions in the wake of what seems to be a pretty radical shift in what's going on in the world just in the last few years. So I'm just a little bit of background. So it's not advancing. Can someone give me a help in how to get it to advance? Usually I just press here. And maybe now it will. Yeah. Okay. So some years ago, maybe before the events of the last few years, someone outside geography knew that I was a political geographer. That's kind of my main subfield. Asked me, what's the most critical issue that political geographers are dealing with today? Very hard question to answer in some ways. But it encouraged me to think broadly, and I think, well, one of the key questions, I wouldn't say it's the only one, but one of the key questions is how to think about the interplay between political territorial structures that have some fixity to them and a world that was increasingly globalized, interconnected, fluid, as we sort of think about things these days, or at least did until fairly recently. And I think I answered it this way, if I could just give you a little bit of background on my own sort of work in political geography, because ever since I was a graduate student or postgraduate student, as it's sometimes called, I've been interested in questions of the political organization of space, what it means, how it functions, and so forth. It actually goes all the way back to my doctoral dissertation research, which focused on the partitioning of Belgium along language lines. So you all probably know Belgium's a country in Western Europe, and this is a modern administrative map of Belgium. The northern part is called Flanders, and it's dominantly Flemish or Dutch speaking. The southern part is, the red part is dominantly French speaking. It's called Wallonia. And then there's some complications around Brussels, the Orange area, and a little German speaking area in the east. In any case, I was interested in trying to understand the relationship between the political organization of space and cultural formulations, cultural patterns. And so I went over to Belgium. I was doing research in Belgium and a little bit struggling with what it was I really wanted to say about what was going on there. And then I came across, and maybe this is useful for graduate students who are trying to sort of figure out what their line of research might be. I came across a quotation at the beginning of an article in the Financial Times, which is a serious newspaper, and a newspaper I actually like quite a bit in many ways. But it was a story about the latest problems of Flemings and Walloons getting together in Belgium. And it was a story that started out in a really geographically illiterate way. Here was more or less the quote. I've never been able to quite find it exactly, but it was asked recently why, and I've did the colors so you can see, Dutch-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia should have united to become a common state. In 1830, a Belgian commentator noted unequivocally, it was an historical accident. So that was the beginning of the article. Now, that beginning to an article makes about as much sense as if I asked you today, why did you decide to come to the lecture this afternoon in the middle of a snowstorm? And you just looked at me and you said, well, kind of felt like it. So, postmodernists aside, it wasn't snowing today. Yet you ignored that premise to the question, and you just answered it as if there was nothing problematic. Asked recently why these two regions united, the term Wallonia wasn't even coined until the 1880s. Nobody didn't even use the term. Flanders at the time meant the old medieval Flanders, which was now northwest Netherlands, northwest Belgium, and the eastern parts of France.
It was not these regions. But what we tend to do often when we see a political map is we just take the spaces that are there and we say, okay, what's going on in them? It gave me the core idea for my thesis. How did these regions actually come into being? And how did they both reflect things that were on the ground, where lots of identities were local, and how did they shape things? So this interest in the relationship between the political organization of territory on the one hand, and other kinds of formulations on the other has been with me kind of throughout my career. And you know, obviously, I have not spent my whole career looking at Belgium as much as I enjoy the beer and chocolate, but I've sort of scaled up from there, looking a lot at questions of the political organizations of space at the state scale, questions of sovereignty, questions of identity, and so forth, and things that fit in between the traditional map of states, like transboundary cooperation agreements and how they sometimes across boundaries, sometimes within different regions. And a lot of my early work was in Europe, even though I've been turning a little bit more to Asia over the course of the last 10 years or so. So that's the backdrop from which I approach the way I think about the topic I'm talking about today. But all these efforts to try to understand the political organization of space, of course, are up against a world which in the course of the last few decades has been fundamentally transformed in many ways by globalization, by the interconnections that exist in terms of communication systems. And I mean, my students think of me as a product of the early Holocene, when they realized there was not email, there was not an internet when I was going through graduate school. Transnational corporations, migration, and so forth. All of this is a function that has captured logically our attention in significant ways. But of course, it still sits in some way in some pretty dynamic tension with the sort of more traditional ways we think about territory and how territory is organized. But it's the tension, I think, that's actually really key in trying to understand what's going on, and that I've been kind of interested in throughout my career. Well, if you think back about 12 or 15 years ago, it was what I'm trying to evoke in the diagram at the bottom is the interconnected fluid world. And there was so many examples and such a power to all these interconnections that it was hard not for that to become a real focus of attention. And that was aided by conceptual developments that were going on in the discipline. So I'm teaching a course at the moment at HKU on basically history of geographic thought. We've made our way through the quantitative revolution and structuralism and humanism, and when you get to the sort of post-structuralist ideas, where a lot of the focus is on relationships, relationality, relational spaces, the ways in which we shouldn't just start with spaces, but think about how they become as a result of these relationships. That was what was kind of occupying so much attention 12 or 15 years ago. Not just in political geography, of course, but in many parts of the discipline. And I found much of this work quite interesting and engaging, and tried to incorporate some of it in the work I was doing. But at the same time, I had been doing a good deal of travel in different places, and I kept thinking, yes, we live in a very fluid, interconnected world, but I've been actually spending a fair amount of time in Russia. I'm starting to visit China more. I've been in Iran, something very rare for Americans, and to see even the combination of the strength of nationalism as an ideology being pushed in many ways by central state authorities, and the ways in which there were efforts to sort of capture everything from the flow of information to just sort of documentation and so forth. I thought, let's not let the pendulum go so far that we forget about the other part of this dynamic that I'm sketching here. So I wrote an article just after 2010, and it was an article that the only time in my life I've come up with a short, catchy
title for an article. And the article was titled Territories Continuing Allure. Sometimes my advisor in graduate school used to say, forget about the long titles with the colons, and yet the title of my dissertation itself takes about 3 hours to read. But what I was trying to capture in this article was the notion that even as we live in an increasingly interconnected, fluid world, we have to keep in mind that this is up against actually a very structured territorial world in many ways. And even at the time, this is before the huge rise in right-wing populist territorial nationalist movements and so forth. There were examples of territorial struggles. There were already limits being put on migration, overt appeals to nationalist territorial ideas and so forth. So that was my sort of first entry into all of this. Well, 10 years later, after publishing this article, I had the chance to participate in a symposium in Stockholm in honor of Anssi Passi. And Anssi Passi, name that might be known to some of you, a very well-known Finnish political geographer whose focus has been on concepts and functionings of territory, a longtime friend of mine, was receiving the Vega Medal from this is the award ceremony by the King of Sweden. And they always have a little symposium in conjunction with the Vega Medal, and they invite a couple of people from outside, and you spend the morning doing academic things, and then you go get the medal. So I was lucky enough, this is my first post-pandemic trip, to be invited to participate in this. And so I asked them, well, sort of what do you want me to do? And what they said they wanted me to do, which was the title of the article, which is in part what today is based on, was to reflect back. So we're 10 years later. When I published initially Territories Continuing Allure, I got some pushback, not a small amount, from some saying, aren't you looking too far, backwards? We need to think forwards. And it's a little bit, it's not being open enough to what's going on to, sort of focus on this. So the title, as you can tell, of today's talk is very much influenced by the title of this talk. So I'm going to in part base this on that, but I'm going to go beyond that as well. So just a little bit for those of you who may not be quite as steeped in some of this literature, some of the sort of conceptual backdrop to what was happening 15 years ago, when the pendulum was swinging very far in the direction of fluidity, interconnectivity, relational spaces, and so forth. And I think there were sort of two lines of research that were particularly important in sort of pushing people to think beyond the kind of traditional territorial map. And one of them was the post-structuralist influence work that is captured by somebody like John Allen, who wrote this piece, Topological Twists, Powers Shifting Geometries. And another was just people like John Agnew, in many ways, a longtime colleague and friend of mine, who has taken, certainly some elements of the post-structuralist critique to heart, but is still kind of less far on the spectrum of sort of relationalist thinking, just trying to look at how things actually work on the ground, and to say, sovereignty isn't what we think it is. It's not as if a map of the countries of the world is actually a map of sovereign spaces. So the topological argument, the post-structuralist one, is captured a little bit by a quote like this, the limited ability of conventional geometric concepts to account for recent spatial shifts in the architecture of power. And in kind of the more popular vein, you have people like Parag Khanna from Singapore writing, about connectography, and, we need to get beyond the old way we map the world and think about it in other ways. And then there's the kind of sovereignty argument that John Agnew was raising. So this quote, again, I think is kind of revealing. It points out that even seemingly most Westphalian of states, so what Westphalia is perhaps one of the most famous, if not the most famous treaty in the history of modern international law. And it was a treaty that brought to an end the 30 Years' War in Europe in 1648.
And it's often thought of as the concept of sovereignty comes from this treaty. Because after 30 years or 30 plus years of conflict, no one was winning, and they finally, it was a war that had its roots in part in religious differences. And they enter into a treaty that just said, okay, with all these little units, and there were a lot of them at the time, whatever the ruler of the unit says is the religion of my area, that's going to be the religion of the area. Nobody else can say anything about it. So it was kind of a sovereignty kind of argument. So he's saying that even the seemingly most Westphalian, in other words, traditional sovereignty states are riddled with power networks whose extension beyond territorial boundaries can render claims to sovereignty moot or inappropriate. And then there's a lot of literature in that tradition. I don't disagree with either of these in many ways. But in that Territories Continuing Allure article, what I made the argument is that these modernist notions of territory and territoriality still have a kind of stickiness to them. I mean, you know the term sticky. If you have chewing gum and you put it down on after you've chewed it, you put it down on the desk and you try to pull it off, it kind of sticks, right? So it's not easy to change. And it has a stickiness to it that we kind of have to take seriously if we're going to understand the world in which we live. And actually, maybe I got the invitation to the Vega Medal because Ansi-Passi had been making some of these kinds of arguments as well. So he actually wrote a response to that John Allen piece I had up there a minute ago. We still have certain sociospatial elements that we cannot write off, he argues, including material practices like boundary making, representations and mapping, and lived meanings that we, sort of are part of the mix. And indeed, even John Agnew himself, after at one point writing that sovereignty really is an archaic concept, says, well, okay, but the present regime still has a lot of mileage in it. Now, as someone who was educated in the discipline of geography, and I realize some of you have ties with geography and some of you don't, but for those of us with ties of geography, there's actually a lot of developments in research and concepts that in many ways shouldn't make us surprised. That even in the face of a very increasingly fluid, interconnected world, there is a lot of inertia to the prior system. And I mean, just to give a few examples, Robert Sack back in the 1980s, I guess, middle 80s, was publishing this book on human territoriality, making an argument that when you divide things up territorially, it becomes a powerful way of communicating difference. It sediments things in a ways that are difficult to change. And it structures power relations in ways that are difficult to change. And then you've got people like Ansi-Passi making the argument that the whole way that when we live in a modernist territorial system, there's all sorts of ways in which the state is involved in socializing us to think of questions of us and them along these lines. Or another Finnish political geographer, Jouni Hakli, writing about state-driven knowledge production. And every time we see a list of countries of the world and their GDP, that's how we kind of conceptually divide up the world. Every time we map the world with the kind of map that's shown on the bottom there, we use it to look at infant mortality or something like that. We're reinforcing this notion. This is the way the world is structured. And then I tried to make a little modest contribution of my own, actually playing off of the work of Prasenjit Dwara, who's written about China. Great example of globalization, actually. So here's a guy who came from India, works on China, and spent much of his career in the United States. So it's a perfect globalization story. But he was developing a kind of historical account in China about how a particular notion of Chineseness and the Chinese nation came to be normalized, so that vast numbers of people sort of think of themselves, as non-Chinese some way or another, and how that crowded out other ways of identity. And so he talked about how the state is involved in this in creating what he called regimes of national legitimation. And I was making the argument that, just as the state does this in terms of how we think about peoplehood. They also do this geographically, territorially. So, you know, what is properly China? What is properly the United States? What is properly Ecuador? What have you? So that was the argument from 2012. But of course, 10 years later, we've had a lot of changes going on. And one has been the increasing growth of the global populist turn that now seems to be in sort of hyperdrive. And the other, of course, was the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because I think they're fairly obvious, but I think it's just worth reminding ourselves just how much these two developments really changed in some ways our fundamental thinking about what we should pay attention to or not. For all the fact that I got a fair amount of pushback in 2012 when I published Territories Continuing Allure, not too many people are laughing anymore. And it's maybe the only time in my life when I've actually written something that maybe is a little bit ahead of the curve when I was sort of thinking about these sorts of things. So the globalist, populist, nationalist turn is obviously something that has been very much on the rise. It was not as if it wasn't around in in 2010 or 11 when I was working on that piece. We already saw a significant rise, but I don't have an update on this graph, which I did not create myself. I wish somebody else would do it for me. But the escalation is clearly obvious. And it's evident, of course, in the coming into power. Not all these people are still in power, but the coming into power of a variety of regimes in different countries that, and this is not all of them, of course, but that have been very much based on the idea of we need to foreground the circumstances and rights of our country over others. And that we have lived in a world that has not served the interest of our people, and we need to strengthen the boundaries and control our own economies and push back against the trends, the fluidity and interrelated trends that have shaped the world. So obviously, the events of just the last few days even are kind of a perfect example of this as it's going into its extreme. So everything from Brexit to the recent, not so recent, I guess now, elections in Argentina, to what was going on in Turkey a few weeks ago, to the whole Trump tariff regime, where the U.S. president seems to be doing what he can to bring not only the global economy but my own country to its knees, is emblematic of this way of organizing and thinking about the world, which is clearly having significance in terms of what we think about and what we're aware of. I'm sure we're all aware also to some degree of the roots of all this. But globalization often becomes the sort of signal thing that we focus on, but it's not kind of globalization sort of in the abstracting and by itself. Globalization has in some ways promoted and increased inequality, but it's not the only thing that has done that. And yet the inequality that has been exacerbated in countries like my own is often seen as something that has been produced by globalization, the winners and losers of globalization, giving rise to a populist significant percentage of the population that was out on the streets of Paris 2 days ago, contesting the judicial decision that Marine Le Pen can't run for office. It's the same sort of thing. These are people who feel like they've been disadvantaged by the system. But then you also have this extraordinary information environment which we live in now, where people can effectively live in these information ecospheres, where they only hear things that kind of reinforce their own way of thinking about the world. And it's a very different kind of way of even absorbing information about the world than the one that I, in any case, grew up in. which means that you get these ideas going and they have some inertia to them, and then that easily sort of perpetuates that inertia. And then there's just the complexities of the contemporary world that make it harder and harder in some ways for states to actually act effectively in response to various kinds of problems. So all of this sort of feeds into this populist nationalism. And what goes along with that then is not only a sort of nationalist revival, as John Judas titles this book, but also a kind of resentment of those who have sort of been in charge, you know, the economic elites, the intellectual elites, and so forth. It's a kind of resentment of the managerial elites. And it doesn't just come from the right. There's been obviously reactions to globalization that, you know, that reflect concerns about what the World Trade Organization and so forth does. There's been on the other side this extraordinary growth in border walls. This just shows you up through 2016, and it's actually sort of increased from there, which shows you that one of the signature issues of all this, which really reminds us that territory still matters, is in fact migration. So immigration is a sort of a key issue, and I wish that I've been looking for sort of some surveys that would be, I could look longitudinally at the same kind of question asked over time. But the Pew Global Attitudes Survey back in 2007 was asking, you know, people in different countries, is immigration a big problem? And maybe not too surprisingly, Italy says yes. You know, they're right at the northern side of the Mediterranean, lots of migrants coming across the Mediterranean. And you've got a few others that are high, but most of these are well under 50%. And in fact, a lot of them are relatively small. So it wasn't the same kind of question, but then the end of the 2010s, they were asking people, also Pew was asking people, you know, do you want more migrants, fewer migrants, about the same number? And it's pretty striking that the medians for these groupings of countries they we're looking at suggest much higher percentages in general than was the case 10 years previously. All right, so that's one side of the equation. More briefly on the other side of the equation, because it's even more obvious, is the border closures and the whole sort of retraction into the state that happened in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just the way we mapped the cases of COVID, the people who came down with COVID or died of COVID, the way they were mapped, it was, I mean, this is not a very helpful map actually in telling you where COVID cases are. And yet for every map that might have shown, you know, clusters near borders or across borders or anything, there were 100 maps that mapped cases in exactly this way. So it's hard not to agree with this statement. It only took a sub-microscopic pathogen to confirm that when a crisis strikes, it's the national framework that becomes crucial in offering a sense of security to disoriented and oriented masses. And I think this became clear in all sorts of ways. You remember the whole discussion of vaccine nationalism, you know, who would get the vaccine, and this actually, the predictions here didn't fall out exactly the way they were predicting. But again, it's a state by state. We have the vaccine, we prioritize it for our citizens. I mean, this is a very territorialized, you know, kind of way of dealing with things. So, you know, there have been various sort of academic discussions that have been sort of focused around these sorts of things. And in almost all cases, this is one of the more interesting ones in a publication called Nations and Nationalism, but bringing together people from different fields, and they, you know, sort of come almost a universal agreement that to quote, it is transnational institutions rather than states that are likely to fall victim to the pandemic, and that in many cases was quite true. All right. I could say lots more about either of those, but I think these are things, you know, they're pretty well understood. So the real question is, you know, what do we do with all this? How do we think about this? How do we confront it going forward? So on the one hand, one of the most cited articles in the contemporary political geography literature was a piece written by John Agnew
in the middle 1990s called The Territorial Trap. And, he was arguing how much we just sort of default to political territories when sort of thinking about what's going on in the world, often with sort of really unfortunate consequences, because just like the map of COVID cases shows, you don't really see what the underlying patterns are, but we default to that assumption. And there was really an argument against doing that, which I thoroughly agree with. But it doesn't mean that territory still doesn't matter. So, as the statement comes up here, I mean, it seems to me that the real challenge is to try to find how we deal with these things in conversation with one another. How we, and as we try to do that, what are the implications for understanding the changing world? So I want to spend the latter part of my talk here looking at sort of three areas of implications for trying to sort of take these things seriously. One, in the basic research arena in geography. Maybe I'll spend a little less time on that because I think that's probably the most obvious. But also, there are a lot of geographers who contribute or try to contribute to policymaking. What is it? What do we do there? And even who seek to comment on things that are going on in the modern world. So, on the research front, it's sort of interesting that there are works such as the ones that are shown up here on this slide that were very influential in sort of political geography circles for a significant period of time. The book, this is really about how Thailand gradually developed a kind of normal sense of this is Thailand. It's really relates to my regimes of territorial legitimation argument. But Ben Anderson's comments about, about how we think about nationalism, the issues of boundary drawing and how that affects identity patterns, these were really key. They've kind of fallen a little bit off the horizon. And I would argue that if we're actually going to understand the world, we need to bring these back in some ways, because they have important things to tell us. And what they suggest is that as we're trying to understand what's going on in the world today, we actually need to give some due weight to what some people might think of as anachronistic or old-fashioned concepts, like attachments to place and sort of nationalist ideologies and so forth. And I think academics in many ways are uncomfortable in some ways with particularly nationalism. Many of us think of ourselves as citizens of the world, and yet we have to in some way come to grips with a really powerful way that many people make sense of themselves. And even the smaller scale ways in which many people live. I've never been able to get a good answer to a question I've always wondered about, so maybe one of you can help. But I was involved in one of these random conversations that only nerdish academics can have some years ago. And the question came up, what percentage of the world's people in their entire lifetimes have never physically moved, their bodies have never moved beyond, I forgot what it was, 150 kilometers from the place where they were born? What percentage of the world's population? And so I've got all sorts of answers to this that range from 20% to close to 50%. And I don't know what's right. But even if it's a small end of that, that's a lot of people, right? That's a lot of people, and it may well be more. Well, if we are, in fact, students of the human condition, and we're trying to say something about the human condition, that's kind of at the extreme end, but maybe we ought to pay some attention to that. And certainly we need to pay attention to some of these kind of identity concepts that at one and the same time are being disrupted by fluidity and interconnectivity, but in other cases are sort of being producing reactions to that. One way in which, in some ways, one might say they are all the globalization is, and the reactions thereto might be producing less ties to territory, is the way that it has polarized populations and make one wonder, at some point, is there going to be some conflict that's actually going to change the contemporary territorial order, because no longer
is there the mass of Americans who sort of feel, first and foremost, I'm American, but now we have to feel embarrassed when we go overseas because, what's going on in our country, which is kind of my position right now. Against those who then, are very much, a part of it. Just, one quick example, and if I were giving you a classic research talk, I would have spent the whole time on this. I just got a chapter coming out in the book that first appeared at the AAG meeting last week. The University of Chicago Press has done this book on territorial imaginaries. And the chapter I wrote with one of my graduate students for this was really focused on the question of, that's gotten a lot of attention in political science recently, of not just where there are border conflicts, but under what circumstances do border conflicts get solved? Because there are instances where there've been entrenched border conflicts that pretty much have settled down. Guatemala, Belize being an example. And there's a big increasing literature on this. It's focused on a whole variety of sort of legal arrangements and functional arrangements on the ground and so forth. But the point that we're trying to make in this chapter is, yeah, those things can matter, but what also matters is the kind of cultural historical story that people tell themselves about their territory, their right to the territory. And we contrast the Greece-Turkey case with the Ecuador-Peru case. In both cases, if you look at Greece, Turkey versus Ecuador, Peru, and you look over the last 100 years, there's been more loss of life in the Ecuador, Peru territorial conflict, more overt conflict in that territorial dispute than in Greece, Turkey. But Ecuador and Peru is more or less settled as of the Brazilian Accords of the late 1990s. And it's hard to explain that, I think, if you don't sort of think in terms of the sort of fundamental ethnocultural territorial arguments that undergirded the way people thought about this. It was much more in the Ecuador-Peru case, it was much more kind of historical, these boundaries were adjusted at the time unfairly. But on both sides, you've got Spanish-speaking peoples with indigenous minorities and significant mestizo component and dominantly Christian and so forth. And now you go to Greece, Turkey, and it's rooted in language and religion and a historical sense of territory. I don't think you can actually get at the explanation if you don't look at those things as well. That's the kind of argument. Well, to continue on then on the research side of things, Henry Young was introduced at the beginning of this. I had the good fortune of hearing a talk that Professor Young gave in Eugene, Oregon, where I live mostly, but not now, a couple of years ago. Was it already 2 years ago? And what of course is going on is, this incredibly powerful and important way of looking at the world and understanding the world is there's a recognition. We have to sort of put that in conversation now, right? And I had to miss the talk I think you gave on this theme here in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, but it's emblematic of the kinds of considerations that need to be taken into account. Even things that seem to undermine the territorial system often carry with them the inertia of that system. So you can think of things like, the various ethnocultural movements in various places. They don't like the way the map is configured. The Serbs in Kosovo don't think that this is the right way to draw the map. The Azerbaijani Armenian conflict over in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Basques, more traditionally in northeastern Spain. But it's interesting when you think about, well, what are they asking for? They're not actually asking for a fluid, interconnected world. They're asking for a territory of their own. And what territory do they want? The one historically that had some actual boundaries to it and functional significance to it. So I think it's another example of how we can or should take these things into consideration. Okay. implications for geographic efforts to contribute to policymaking. One of the really striking failures, I think, of, and I can speak more powerfully to US foreign policy than other areas, because that's something I've studied, but one of the more striking failures of US foreign policy, I think, over the years, has been actually the failure to give adequate weight to actually ethno-territorial nationalist sort of ideas and sentiments that exist in various places. It was certainly evident in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. When I was invited on my campus to give a talk in front of a huge forum, we filled like 2,000 people into, the students were all concerned about this and what's going on. We had this huge dialogue about what was going on. And I remember right in the aftermath of the invasion, a few of us were asked to address. So what do we think is going to be happening here? And I started talking about things like the Kurdish North, the Sunni Center, the Shia South, what that meant in terms of where oil resources were, and the importance of actually thinking, if you want people to buy into some post-invasion regime, the importance of actually thinking about distribution of resources across ethnic communities. This was not even being talked about in DC. And in fact, some of the institutions that were that might have actually bolstered the post-invasion regime were actually given little attention. The disbanding of the army actually turned out to be a disastrous consequence. Much more recently, with the whole emergence of South Sudan, nobody much was talking about the fact that actually there are significant ethno-territorial divisions within South Sudan. And it was not, everybody's surprised when South Sudan comes into being and the president and the vice president are from different ethnocultural groups, and then a major conflict breaks out between them. Why should they be surprised? If we're actually taking this stuff seriously, we should be able to actually say something about this. But then I think more importantly, how can we, as geographers and people who think geographically, contribute in some ways to things that we might care about? I mean, there's a significant body of scholarship and geography of related fields about immigration. There are various plans for immigration reform. And this is just one book that one of my former colleagues, Susan Hardwick, contributed to. She's done, Brookings Institution studies. There are all these plans for how do we reform immigration. They've almost all failed. I mean, there's not really been, at least in my country, a really significant, effective immigration reform plan. And I think in some ways why they've failed is that on the one hand, there is been too much resistance amongst those who think we should just keep the borders open and let the people flow, to understand the arguments that are made on one side about, well, but what does this mean for local communities? On the other hand, there's this very inward-looking, myopic kind of view that just sort of, let's shut everything down. So these are just my own crazy ideas. But it's, if you acknowledge both of these, but that there's something there for both of these, it might suggest kinds of immigration reform plans that actually try to put together something about, well, the fluidity that is migration with the fixity that is that are these sort of populist sentiments around immigration. So, how about tying immigration reform to community development grants that are specifically aimed at job opportunities? That's often, a lot of the claim. Well, people are going to lose jobs if immigrants come. Making the path for citizenship for those who aren't documented, who come across without, documentation, contingent on some kind of national or community service. Okay, yes, you're buying into the state in this way, but realistically, is that, are you going to be able to do anything other than that? Or even, promoting more humane borderland policing practices, but in conjunction with maybe some locally protectionist measures that might help out communities that are being inundated a bit, which is happening in places like southern Italy and southern Greece in this arena. Okay, finally, the implications for geographically informed commentaries on current events. And I'm going to just grab here from something else I've written fairly recently, but the journal Political Geography did a forum. It's an online forum. They asked a few of us to offer some commentaries on, what was going on and how we understand what was going on with the Russia-Ukraine war. And so what I'm going to share with you now is kind of the essence of what I've had to say, but I think it speaks to this whole sort of dynamic that I've tried to address this afternoon. So, in one sense, you could say the Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, what could tell us more about the continuing significance of territory than one country? It looks like it wants territory in another. Fine, let's all accept that's part of the mix, but it's more complicated than that. And in fact, the ways in which territorial arrangements and ideas permeate what's going on aren't just about who gets what territory. We could start by saying, actually, there's a lot of extraterritorial dimensions to this whole conflict. So just as a backdrop to the way I'm going to look at it, I mean, this is a conflict where I remember somebody writing, after the first week of the conflict, we know more about what's happening in this conflict in 1 week than we knew after a month and a half of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Just because of all the ways and now in which sort of communication and interaction occurs. But of course, it's also a conflict that has, various kinds of technologies that are not necessarily state-based technologies involved, drone use in various ways and so forth. It's very much interrelated with trade networks that shape the fates and possibilities of different regions. I'm running long, so I'm going to be a little bit short here. Obviously, the whole sort of internet ecosphere is one that you cannot understand, in old-fashioned territorial terms. Cyber warfare is part of what's going on. This is not sort of territorial in the traditional sense of the word. But my argument here is that to actually understand what's going on, you have to see it as a project that is shaped in some ways by these sort of more traditional, I'd call them modernist, because they sort of came out of the rise of the modern state system, territorial ideas and norms that go beyond just, oh yeah, it's my territory, it's your territory, the usual national security terms about is NATO expanding, and all this kind of stuff. So I think there are three ways in which you can see how these influences permeate. That's Vladimir Putin, who is the actual titular head of the Russian Geographical Society. I'm sorry to say, I don't think he has any influence on the day-to-day workings of the society. But in any case, there he is. And I think you can see this in the arguments that are used to justify the invasion, the way that the global response unrolled, and the way we think about potential outcomes. So, on the eve of the invasion, it was just literally within 24 or 48 hours of the invasion, there was a long, very widely publicized speech that Putin gave to the Russian people. And it's a complex story, and I'm not going to go into it. Happy to discuss it more in Q&A. But it was interesting how much emphasis was given not just to, the Russians in southeastern Ukraine are not being well treated by the Ukrainians. It was a broad historical nation state, this is our territory kind of argument. It was an argument premised, he starts out by saying, if you go back, and this is not wrong, it's a very partial account, but it's not wrong. If you go back and you sort of look at the origins of the Ukrainians with the Russians, they have a common origin back in the 900s to this mix of everything from Vikings to others who had sort of founded this heartland. And the ways in which this had, the expansion of the Russian Empire over time, this had become an integral, creating Russians. That was the whole idea, creating Russians in this area that aren't just necessarily even just the people in the Donbass in the southeast, but this was creating a larger Russian nation state in the traditional understanding of the word, right? For people to feel themselves to be one, having a country of their own. and it gets extended on through the Soviet Union period. Of course, nothing is said about things like, you know, the fact that the Poles controlled Western Ukraine for a long period of time. So it's a very partial telling of history, but it's one very much rooted in the whole concept of this is rightfully our territory based on this whole sort of way in which we understand the nation state and its role in the contemporary world. The global response. Within a this is March 2nd, just within days of the invasion, you get 141 countries, UN members, that vote to condemn the invasion. That's pretty remarkable. Now, if you look at this against the backdrop of, this is not a good map, by the way, please don't take a photo of this map and say, Alec Murphy said this is a good map. It's a bad map. It's a bad map because what it does is it throws together so many different types of territorial disputes. So you could have some sort of minor little discussion over is this island in the middle of the river mine or yours? Or you could have, you know, troops amassed on glaciers between India and Pakistan. I put it up there just to say, unfortunately, we live in a world with lots of boundary conflicts, lots of territorial disputes, which alone, I guess, is why territory matters. But there are only 2 cases in the last 25 years where there has been anything like the number of countries that have rallied behind some kind of opposition to some effort to sort of push control over one side of a border or another. Those 2 cases were, first of all, the case of not the more recent Iraq war, but when Iraq moved into Kuwait and took it over in the late 1990s, right? And the other was the Ukraine one. In both cases, you had countries that had traditionally been kind of geopolitically at odds with one another, and they came together and rallied behind an opposition to it. Why are those 2 cases different from all the other cases? And I think the only real answer to that, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, is that those are the 2 cases where basically one country was not just saying, I get a little bit of territory in your country. Those are the cases where one country is effectively being obliterated from the map. The map is going to change. It's no longer going to be a Kuwait on the map. There's no longer going to be Ukraine on the map. I mean, that was the original push. So in other words, we're so rooted into the idea, yeah, we may not have all the borders right, but those are the way the world should be, that it takes something of that order to get that kind of response. Talk about the whole of the norms of the modern state system on the geographical imagination. I think that's it. Finally, you'll be glad to hear. The spatial imaginaries that have shaped thinking about conflict outcomes, conflict resolution, and so forth. There's no question in the very early going, the tack that Putin and Russia was taking was about Ukraine tout court, the entire Ukraine. That was kind of the way that it was all being cast. It was either going to be a Ukrainian state or it was going to be what he felt to be properly part of Russia. Well, that's interestingly kind of at odds with how Ukraine was actually functioning in terms of on-the-ground attitudes and ideas in the decade before the conflict. So there are 2 American political geographers, John O'Loughlin at the University of Colorado and Gerard Toll at Virginia Tech, who had been involved in these large-scale surveys of attitudes in Ukraine before the conflict. And they found remarkably that you ask a question like, I see myself as European, this is the West, ooh, really high, not here. Or I feel like a European is really correlated with distance from the West to the East. So that was actually the reality on the ground. So if we had been able to think somehow beyond Ukraine, Russia, might it have been possible to actually entertain the kinds of concepts that might help us get beyond some of the territorial conflicts we have in the world today? consideration given to things like, parallel statehood or joint citizenship. I mean, these ideas have been proposed in Israel, Palestine, they were proposed in Sri Lanka before that. The idea of, maybe we don't have to actually divide up the world in a modernist territorial way. It has to be either yours or it's mine. Because that actually is an incredible source of conflict in the world today. And it's rooted very much in this way that we think about and imagine territory. But if we think that's going away, we have to recognize that it becomes something not even really thought about much in a case like this. Now, that is harder to think about it now in the wake of the violence that's happened. But it's very interesting that we just don't, there's a partial exception in Northern Ireland, where in Northern Ireland, there was a kind of joint sovereignty arrangement that was put into place. But that hardly ever gets considered elsewhere. It's either China or it's India. It's either Israel or it's Palestine. It's either Venezuela or Guyana. I mean, I can go on and on. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of these around the world. All right, so to conclude. My basic argument today, going back to this sort of diagram, that we certainly cannot and should not ignore all the ways in which fluidity, interrelatedness are altering the world, even as they're being drawn back in some ways. We're not at the end of this. I mean, you're not going to sort of fundamentally change some of the ways in which we communicate with one another. Well, I mean, there's always, of course, the possibility of some kind of global major conflict, which, one can only hope we don't replay the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries. There's a lot of been worrying about, to what extent things resemble World War II. I worry more about how they resemble the lead up to World War I, where it was kind of the first phase of globalization. There was quite a bit of globalization in the late 19th, early 20th century. But we can't ignore that. It's at least unlikely to go away. But we actually need to take the modernist territorial order seriously. And right back to my little Belgium example, that means not just describing territories, but thinking about what they mean, how they become, how they hold on our imagination, how they affect people, how people see themselves and others. And last slide, what this suggests to me is that we actually need to be thinking about some questions, the kinds of questions, at least in my area of political geography, that actually don't get a lot of attention in many cases. Like, how does the commitment to sovereignty and sovereignty ideals shape our thinking about the world, shape interactions, shape international cooperation? I think this is the one that's most beginning to be addressed now. But then how does the failure to take territories continuing a little seriously, how has that led to the kind of policy debacles, a couple of which I've tried to describe today, or produce some fundamental misunderstandings? And then what kinds of circumstances are most conducive to the deepening or erosion of the current kinds of territorial arrangements and attachments that we've been talking about today? So there it is. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope I didn't go on too long. I worry I did, but in any case, thank you so much.